The dust kicked up by Jacob Whitmore's wagon wheels hung in the air like a prayer unanswered, settling slowly on the parched earth of the Wyoming Territory. The summer of 1882 had been merciless, draining the life from crops and hope from hearts with equal cruelty. Jacob pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the brutal afternoon sun that beat down on his shoulders like the blows of an angry fate. His mare, Old Belle, plodded forward with the wary determination of a creature who had seen too many hard miles and knew there were still more ahead. The road to Sweetwater Creek stretched before them like a scar across the landscape, rutted and unforgiving. Jacob had made this journey countless times over the past 15 years, hauling supplies from town to his modest ranch on the outskirts of civilization. Each trip brought its own challenges, but today felt different somehow, heavy with an expectation he couldn't name. The silence was broken only by the creak of leather and wood, the steady clop of Belle's hooves, and the whisper of wind through the sparse grass that struggled to grow in this unforgiving land. It was then that he saw her, a small figure hunched by the roadside like a discarded doll. At first, Jacob thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, the heat creating mirages of hope where none existed. But as his wagon drew closer, the image solidified into reality. A little girl no more than 7 or 8 years old sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her face buried in her arms. Her small frame shook with sobs that seemed too large for such a tiny vessel to contain. Jacob pulled back on the reins, bringing Belle to a gentle stop. The sudden cessation of movement seemed to amplify the child's crying, each sob cutting through the afternoon air like a knife through silk. He sat for a moment, uncertainty weighing heavy in his chest. In this wild country, caution was often the difference between seeing another sun rise and becoming food for the vultures. But looking at this small, broken figure, Jacob felt something stirred deep within him that had little to do with self-preservation and everything to do with the kind of man his late wife Sarah had always believed him to be. Climbing down from the wagon with the careful movements of a man whose joints remembered every hard day of his 45 years, Jacob approached the child slowly. His boots made soft crunching sounds in the dirt, and at the sound, the little girl looked up with eyes that held too much sorrow for someone who had barely begun to live. Her face was streaked with tears and dust, creating muddy rivulets down her cheeks. Her dress, once perhaps blue, was now the color of the earth itself, torn in several places and hanging loose on her small frame. "Easy there, little one," Jacob said softly, his voice carrying the gentle tone he had once used with frightened horses. "Where are your own, your family?" He crouched down a respectful distance away, making himself less imposing to the frightened child. His heart clenched as he took in her appearance more fully. She was thin, desperately so, with the hollow-cheeked look of someone who had known hunger as an unwelcome companion for far too long. The girl's lips trembled as she tried to form words, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're gone," she managed, fresh tears spilling over. "The fever took Mama 3 days past, and Papa." Her voice broke entirely, and she dissolved into renewed sobbing. "Papa didn't wake up this morning. I waited and waited, but he just wouldn't wake up." Jacob felt his own throat tighten with emotion. He had seen too much death in his years on the frontier, had buried his own share of dreams alongside the bodies of those he loved. But there was something about this child's raw grief that cut straight through all the protective barriers he had built around his heart. Without conscious thought, he found himself moving closer, his weathered hand reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. "I'm sorry, child. Truly sorry." The words felt inadequate, like trying to hold back a flood with his bare hands. "What's your name?" "Emma," she whispered. "Emma Catherine Morrison." She pronounced her full name with the careful precision of a child who had been taught proper manners, even in the face of catastrophe. "We were traveling to California, Papa and Mama and me. Papa said there was gold there enough to make us rich. But then Mama got sick, and we stopped by the creek back there to rest. And then—" She couldn't finish, her small body racked with fresh sobs. Jacob looked back down the road where she had gestured, and he could just make out the dark shape of a wagon in the distance. His stomach churned as he imagined what he might find there. "How long have you been sitting here?" "Emma, since the sun came up," she said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I didn't know what to do. Papa always knew what to do, but now he's gone, and I'm all alone. And I don't know how to get to California by myself." The late afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Jacob realized that this child had been sitting here for hours, exposed to the elements and the dangers that roamed these empty spaces. Mountain lions, wolves, and worse still, the kind of men who would see a defenseless child as easy prey. The thought made his blood run cold. "Listen to me, Emma," he said, his voice taking on the firm but gentle tone he had once used with his own daughter before the cholera took her 10 years ago. "You can't stay here. It's not safe. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and trust that nearly broke his heart. "But where can I go? I don't have anybody left. Papa said we didn't have any kin back east, that California was going to be our new start." Jacob stood slowly, his mind racing through possibilities and obligations. The smart thing would be to take her to town, leave her with the sheriff or perhaps the preacher's wife. Let someone else deal with this tragedy while he went about his business. That would be the practical choice, the safe choice. But as he looked down at Emma's tear-stained face, he found that practicality seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. "Come on," he said, extending his hand to her. "Let's go see about your folks first. They deserve to be laid to rest proper." Emma's small hand slipped into his calloused one, and Jacob felt a jolt of responsibility that went far beyond simple Christian duty. This child was now his burden, his obligation, and perhaps something more that he wasn't quite ready to name. Together, they walked back toward his wagon, Emma's steps uncertain and stumbling with exhaustion. The Morrison wagon sat tilted at an odd angle, one wheel having sunk deep into the soft earth near the creek bank. As Jacob had feared, the smell hit him first, the sweet, cloying odor of death in the summer heat. He squeezed Emma's hand gently. "Stay here with Belle," he told her. "I'll take care of everything." Inside the wagon, Jacob found the bodies of Emma's parents. Her mother, a woman who might once have been beautiful, lay on a makeshift bed of quilts and blankets. Even in death, her face showed the ravages of fever, skin stretched tight over prominent bones. Her husband lay beside her, one arm thrown protectively over her still form. He was a big man, or had been before illness and hardship had whittled him down. His face was peaceful, almost relieved. And Jacob wondered if he had simply given up when faced with the prospect of continuing alone with his grief and his daughter. Jacob spent the next 2 hours digging graves in the hard earth while Emma sat in the shade of his wagon, too exhausted and overwhelmed to do more than watch with hollow eyes. The sun was touching the horizon by the time he finished, his shirt soaked with sweat and his hands bloody from gripping the shovel. He wrapped the bodies carefully in their own quilts, whispering prayers his own mother had taught him over each grave as he covered them with the unforgiving Wyoming dirt. When it was done, Jacob fashioned a simple cross from pieces of the broken wagon and carved the names as best he could remember them. Emma approached slowly, clutching a small cloth doll that had seen better days. She knelt beside the graves and placed a few wildflowers she had gathered, her lips moving in silent words that Jacob couldn't hear but felt in his very soul. "They're in a better place now," he told her, meaning it more than he had meant anything in years. "They're at peace." Emma nodded, but her tears had started again. "What's going to happen to me now?" she asked, her voice so small it was nearly lost in the evening breeze. Jacob knelt beside her, his decision made without conscious thought, but with the certainty of a man who had finally found his true north. "You're going to come home with me," he said simply. "If that's what you want. I've got a little ranch about 10 miles from here. It's not much, but it's safe, and there's room for one more." Emma's eyes widened, and for the first time since he had found her, something like hope flickered across her features. "Really, you'd want me?" The question hit Jacob like a physical blow. Want her? This child who had lost everything, who had been abandoned by fate and circumstance to die alone by the roadside. He thought of his empty house, of the silence that had filled the room since Sarah's death, of the daughter's bedroom he still couldn't bear to enter. Perhaps fate had a sense of irony after all, taking away his family only to place another lost soul directly in his path. "Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected, "I'd be honored to have you, but you need to understand it won't be easy. Ranch life is hard work, and I'm not much for fancy things or city ways. It'll just be you and me against whatever comes." "I can work," Emma said quickly, desperately. "Mama taught me to cook and sew and tend chickens. I won't be a burden, I promise." "I'll earn my keep, child," Jacob said, reaching out to smooth her tangled hair. "You don't need to earn anything. You're not a hired hand. You'd be family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Emma stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could trust this unexpected kindness. Finally, she nodded, and Jacob felt something in his chest that had been clenched tight for years finally begin to loosen. They loaded what few belongings could be salvaged from the Morrison wagon into Jacob's, including Emma's small satchel of clothes and the precious doll she clutched like a lifeline. As full darkness settled over the prairie, Jacob lit a lantern and guided Belle carefully along the familiar path toward home. Emma sat beside him on the wagon seat, swaying with exhaustion but fighting to stay awake, as if afraid that sleep might make this rescue disappear like a dream. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, her voice barely audible over the creak of the wagon wheels. Jacob found himself smiling for the first time in months. "Well, it's not much to look at from the outside. Just a cabin and a barn and some pasture for the cattle. But it's got a good well and a view of the mountains that'll take your breath away come sunrise. Sarah always said." He paused, surprised that speaking his wife's name didn't hurt as much as it usually did. "My wife always said it was the most beautiful place on earth when the wildflowers bloomed in spring." "Will you tell me about her?" Emma asked. "About Sarah." And so, as Belle carried them through the star-filled darkness toward home, Jacob found himself talking about his late wife for the first time since her death. He told Emma about Sarah's laugh, which could fill a room with joy, and her terrible cooking, which he had pretended to enjoy for 15 years of marriage. He talked about her garden, where she had coaxed impossible beauty from the harsh soil, and her dream of having children who would fill their home with noise and chaos and love. "She would have loved you," he said finally, and realized he meant it completely. "She always said our house was too quiet, that it needed the sound of little feet running through it." Emma had fallen asleep against his shoulder by the time the warm glow of lantern light appeared in the distance, marking the location of Jacob's cabin. He carried her inside gently, laying her on the sofa and covering her with one of Sarah's quilts. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, her small face peaceful for the first time since he had found her. Jacob sat in his kitchen long into the night, drinking coffee that had grown cold hours ago and staring at the sleeping child. The magnitude of what he had undertaken was beginning to sink in. He was 45 years old, set in his ways, accustomed to the solitary life of a widower. What did he know about raising a little girl? How could he possibly fill the void left by her parents? But even as doubt crept in, Jacob found himself remembering the look in Emma's eyes when he had promised she would be family. For the first time in 10 years, he had purpose beyond mere survival. This child needed him, not just for shelter and food, but for something deeper and more fundamental. She needed someone to believe in her future, to help her heal from the wounds that went far deeper than grief. The next morning, Jacob woke to the sound of someone moving around in his kitchen. For a moment, still caught between sleep and waking, he thought Sarah had returned from the grave to make him breakfast. But then he remembered, and he found Emma standing on a chair at his stove, carefully tending eggs in his iron skillet. She had washed her face and attempted to braid her hair, though the result was more enthusiasm than skill. "I hope you don't mind," she said, glancing at him nervously. "I woke up early and you were still sleeping, and I thought maybe I could make breakfast. Mama taught me how." Jacob watched her for a moment, this small person who was trying so hard to prove her worth, and felt his heart expand in ways he had forgotten were possible. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, Emma. But you know you don't have to take care of me, don't you? That's not why you're here." She turned to face him, her expression serious beyond her years. "But I want to help. I need to do something useful, or else I'll just think about Mama and Papa all the time, and then I'll cry, and crying doesn't help anybody." Jacob recognized the wisdom in her words, the instinctive understanding that purposeful work could be a salve for grief. He nodded and moved to help her reach the plates on the high shelf, right then. "But from now on we work together. Partners, partners," Emma repeated solemnly, as if sealing a sacred pact. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Jacob with its naturalness. Emma threw herself into ranch life with the fierce determination of someone who had learned that home was not guaranteed. That belonging had to be earned and protected. She fed the chickens and gathered eggs, helped Jacob mend fences and tend to the small vegetable garden Sarah had started years before. In the evenings, she would sit by the fire with her mending, while Jacob read aloud from whatever books he had, her small fingers working steadily while her mind wandered through stories of adventure and distant lands. But it was not all easy adjustment and peaceful domesticity. There were nights when Jacob would wake to the sound of Emma crying in her sleep, calling out for parents who would never answer. There were moments when she would stop in the middle of some task, overwhelmed by memories that hit her like physical blows. During these times, Jacob would simply be present, offering comfort without trying to fix what could not be fixed, understanding that some wounds could only heal with time. The first real test of their new arrangement came 3 weeks after Emma's arrival, when a group of drifters stopped by the ranch asking for water and food. Jacob had dealt with their kind before and recognized the danger immediately. These were men who had abandoned civilized behavior along with civilized society, men who saw weakness as an opportunity and kindness as a flaw to be exploited. Their leader was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached beyond his lips. He introduced himself as Tom Brennan and claimed they were just passing through, looking for honest work. But Jacob noticed how his gaze lingered on Emma, who had instinctively moved closer to Jacob's side, and how the other men positioned themselves strategically around the yard. "Mighty pretty little girl you got there," Brennan said, his voice carrying an undertone that made Jacob's blood turn to ice. "She your daughter?" "She is," Jacob replied firmly, his hand moving casually toward the rifle leaning against the porch railing. "And she's under my protection." Brennan's smile widened, but his eyes remained calculating. "Now, don't get all worked up, friend. We're just making conversation. Times are hard, and a man's got to think about his future, you understand. Little girl like that, she's going to need proper schooling, proper care. More than one old rancher can provide out here in the middle of nowhere." Emma pressed closer to Jacob's side, her small hand gripping his shirt. She might not have understood all the implications of Brennan's words, but she could sense the threat as clearly as any wild animal sensing a predator. Jacob felt her trembling and knew that whatever happened next, he could not show weakness. "The girl is exactly where she belongs," Jacob said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down cattle rustlers and claim jumpers. "And I suggest you and your friends move along before you wear out your welcome." For a moment, the tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Jacob could see Brennan weighing his options, calculating the odds. 3 armed men against one middle-aged rancher and a child should have been no contest. But something in Jacob's steady gaze and confident posture gave the outlaw pause. Perhaps he sensed that this was not a man who would go down without a fight, or perhaps he simply decided the potential reward wasn't worth the certain risk. "No offense intended," Brennan said finally, his tone suggesting anything but apology. "We'll just water our horses and be on our way." Jacob nodded curtly but didn't move from his position until the 3 men had mounted up and ridden out of sight. Only then did he feel Emma's grip on his shirt loosen slightly. "Were they bad men?" she asked in a small voice. "Yes," Jacob said, seeing no point in sugar-coating the truth. "They were bad men. But they're gone now and they won't be back." "How do you know?" Jacob looked down at this child who had already seen too much of life's cruelty, and he chose his words carefully. "Because some fights aren't worth having, Emma. They could see I was ready to protect you no matter what it cost me. And men like that are cowards at heart. They only pick on people who can't fight back." That evening, as Emma helped him check the doors and windows, Jacob realized that protecting this child had already changed him in fundamental ways. The careful, cautious man who had lived alone for 10 years was gone, replaced by someone who would face any danger to keep her safe. It was a responsibility that both terrified and energized him. As summer faded into autumn, Jacob began the process of legally adopting Emma. The paperwork was complicated, requiring multiple trips to the county seat and interviews with officials who seemed skeptical that a bachelor rancher was suitable to raise a young girl. But Emma herself, when questioned, was unwavering in her desire to stay with Jacob. She spoke with the composed certainty of someone who had seen the worst life could offer and recognized genuine safety when she found it. The town doctor, a kindly man named Henderson who had known Jacob for years, became an unexpected advocate. "I've watched Jacob Whitmore for more than a decade," he told the territorial judge. "He's as decent a man as you'll find in these parts, and that child has thrived under his care. She's gained weight, she's healthy, and she's clearly devoted to him. What more could you ask for?" The judge, a stern-faced man named Morrison who took his responsibilities seriously, was more concerned with propriety than practicality. "It's highly irregular," he said, peering at Jacob over his wire-rimmed spectacles. A single man raising a young girl without female supervision. What about her moral education, her preparation for womanhood? Jacob had anticipated this objection and came prepared with his answer. Your Honor, I've already spoken with Mrs. Patterson in town about giving Emma lessons in the domestic arts that I can't teach her myself. And Reverend Collins has agreed to provide religious instruction. She'll have proper guidance in all the areas where my knowledge falls short. It was Emma herself who ultimately swayed the judge's decision. When asked directly what she wanted, she stood up straight and spoke with a clarity that belied her young years. I want to stay with Jacob, she said simply. He saved my life, and he's been nothing but good to me. He's taught me how to work and how to read better, and he never gets angry when I have bad dreams about Mama and Papa. He's the best father a girl could ask for, and I don't want anybody else. The judge studied her for a long moment, then turned to Jacob. Mr. Whitmore, do you understand the full scope of what you're undertaking? This child will need guidance and support well into her adult years. Are you prepared for that commitment? Yes, sir, Jacob replied without hesitation. I am, very well. I'm satisfied that this arrangement serves the child's best interests. The adoption is approved. The day the paperwork was finalized, Jacob took Emma to the general store and bought her a new dress, blue as a summer sky, to celebrate. She wore it to dinner at the hotel restaurant, sitting up straight and using her best manners, while Jacob marveled at how much she had changed since that day he had found her crying by the roadside. So I'm really Emma Whitmore now? She asked, testing the sound of her new name. If that's what you want, Jacob said, though you'll always be a Morrison too. That's where you came from, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. Emma nodded thoughtfully. Emma Catherine Morrison Whitmore. That's a lot of names for one person. Well, you're a lot of person, Jacob said, and was rewarded with one of her brilliant smiles that never failed to light up his world. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow that transformed the harsh landscape into something beautiful and serene. Jacob taught Emma to ice fish and to track rabbits through the snow. She learned to milk their cow and to card wool from their small flock of sheep. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire while Emma practiced her letters and numbers, Jacob helping her work through the arithmetic problems in the worn textbook they had ordered from town. It was during one of these quiet winter evenings that Emma asked a question that revealed how deeply she had been thinking about their situation. Jacob, she said, not looking up from her slate, do you ever get lonely? I mean, before I came here, were you sad all by yourself? The question caught Jacob off guard with its perceptiveness. He had grown so accustomed to having Emma in his life that he had almost forgotten the hollow ache of those solitary years after Sarah's death. Yes, he said honestly, I was lonely. Sadder than I like to admit, even to myself. I thought I was getting along just fine, but I was really just existing, not living. Jacob looked at this remarkable child who had brought such unexpected richness to his life. Now I remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting, worth fighting for. You gave me back my purpose, Emma. You reminded me that there's still good in the world worth preserving. Emma set down her chalk and moved to sit beside him on the rough wooden bench he had built. I'm glad you found me, she said simply. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't stopped that day. I'm glad too, Jacob said, putting his arm around her small shoulders, more glad than I can properly express. As winter deepened, they settled into routines that felt as natural as breathing. Emma proved to have a gift for storytelling, spinning elaborate tales during the long evenings that kept Jacob entertained and amazed. She had inherited her mother's creativity and her father's determination, combined with a resilience that seemed entirely her own. One particularly harsh night, when the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, and the snow piled high against the windows, Emma woke screaming from a nightmare about her parents. Jacob found her sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face, calling out for her mother in a voice that broke his heart. I'm here, he said softly, sitting on the edge of her bed and gathering her into his arms. You're safe, Emma. I'm here. I dreamed they were calling for me, she sobbed against his shoulder. They were lost in the snow and they needed help, but I couldn't find them. I tried and tried, but they kept getting farther away. Jacob held her until the sobs subsided, stroking her hair and murmuring the same comforting words Sarah had once used when their own daughter had nightmares. It was just a dream, he said. Your parents aren't lost? Emma, they're at peace. And you're exactly where you're supposed to be, Promise, she whispered. I promise, Jacob said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers that transformed their valley into a carpet of color. Emma, now taller and stronger after a winter of good food and careful tending, threw herself into the work of planting their expanded garden. She had proven to have Sarah's gift for coaxing life from reluctant soil, and under her care, their vegetable patch promised to be more productive than it had been in years. On a warm May morning, almost exactly 1 year after Jacob had found Emma by the roadside, they stood together on their front porch, surveying the ranch that had become their shared home. Emma was no longer the hollow-eyed, desperate child he had rescued. She was still small for her age, but she radiated the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was loved and valued. Jacob, she said, slipping her hand into his, do you think things work out the way they're supposed to? I mean, do you think maybe Mama and Papa dying and you finding me happened for a reason? It was a question Jacob had wrestled with many times over the past year. The theological implications were beyond him, but the practical reality was undeniable. They had saved each other, this unlikely pair. Emma had given him back his capacity for love and hope, while he had given her safety and stability and the chance to heal from wounds that might have destroyed someone with less resilience. I don't know about divine plans, he said honestly, but I know that finding you was the best thing that's happened to me since Sarah died. I know that you've made me a better man, Emma. You've reminded me what it means to have something worth protecting. Emma squeezed his hand tighter. I used to think life must hate me, to take away Mama and Papa like that. But now I think maybe it just had a different plan. Maybe it knew you needed me as much as I needed you. Jacob looked down at this remarkable child who had somehow managed to find wisdom in tragedy, strength in loss, and hope in the midst of despair. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps some greater design had been at work that day when he had stopped his wagon to investigate a small figure crying by the roadside. Or perhaps it had simply been the random intersection of need and compassion, the kind of everyday miracle that happened when people chose kindness over convenience. Either way, Jacob knew that Emma Catherine Morrison Whitmore had become the most important thing in his world. She was his daughter now, not by blood but by choice, not by accident but by love. And as they stood together watching the sun rise over the mountains that framed their home, Jacob felt something he had thought lost forever, the absolute certainty that tomorrow would be worth seeing, and that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song to the morning sky, and Emma laughed with pure, uncomplicated joy. The sound echoed across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of all the tomorrows yet to come, all the love yet to be shared, all the healing yet to be accomplished by two people who had found each other exactly when they needed it most. The little girl who had once cried by the roadside was crying no more.